My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow the noble Lord who's made a passionate speech against what was determined by more than 400 votes in the other place, which was the withdrawal from the European Union on March the 29th. In my youth, I was a keen rock climber, and one summer evening, I nearly ended both as I wandered off route on a cliff face high above the valley of Glencoe. And as I climbed upwards, the holds became smaller, less frequent, and the rock ahead smoother, greasier and unstable. Hanging on by my fingernails, with a big drop below my heels, my legs began to tremble, and fear suffused me. I had a choice: continue further in the hope that good jugs lay ahead, but risk not being able to reverse my moves and a spectacular fall, or with great difficulty and considerable risk, climb back to the point where I had gone astray and return to the known route I had set out to follow. The response to the White Paper by MPs on both sides of the Brexit debate, the public, Conservative voters, the opposition, and an arrogant and bullying EU, suggests the Prime Minister finds herself in an equally uncomfortable and precarious position. My noble, right honourable and noble friend Lord Heseltine says the government has no plan and blames this on the Brexiteers. This White Paper is Ollie Robbins's plan. It is not the Brexiteers' plan. Indeed, the constitutional outrage is that the Secretary of State's plan was being ignored, and this was being produced in parallel, and he was presented with it some 48 hours before a cabinet meeting where they were invited to agree it or take a taxi home. My response to the climb down was to return. My response was to climb down to the point where I had gone astray. And for the Prime Minister, contrary to what the noble Lord suggests, this means taking the rejected Chequers deal off the table now and returning to, and the noble Lord Mandelson doesn't seem to have noticed it, returning to Mr Barnier's previous offer for a Canada Plus free trade deal. And, it cannot be, and if that cannot be agreed, putting in place arrangements to trade with the EU on the same terms as most countries of the world under the WTO, of which we are members and to which we are paying and have been paying every year a substantial subscription. We do most of our trade now with non-EU countries under WTO rules, which incidentally requires members to facilitate frictionless trade. That is a rule of the WTO, and that includes the EU. And of course, if we end up trading under WTO with no EU trade deal, and contrary to what the noble Lord suggests, there's never been any suggestion that any minister of the government has wanted to do better than that, we will, of course, save every penny of the £39 billion which the EU is demanding. And I defy anyone, of course it doesn't apply to anyone in this House, but I defy anyone to stand for election in this country and explain that they are spending £39 billion in order to receive no conceivable advantage.
I don't know whether the noble Lord has noticed this week's Economist, the headline of which is that the WTO is in danger of collapsing. That does seem to me rather to undermine his suggestion that we should lie entirely on the WTO. He will, of course, recall that it's the US administration which is doing the collapsing.
Well, if the noble Lord is correct, and of course the Economist has a particular view on these matters, then the least of our problems will be leaving the EU if the WTO is collapsing. The Prime Minister should reject the bogus posturing of the Irish Taoiseach as the latest recruit to Project Fear, claiming that if the UK leaves the EU, it would mean our planes could not fly over Ireland. As flyover rules are a matter for an international treaty and has nothing to do with our EU membership, the most charitable interpretation I can put on that is that he didn't know what he was talking about. The least is that he has the same advisers as George Osborne, who promised a punishment budget, higher taxes, soaring interest rates, rising unemployment, inflation and recession within weeks of any decision to vote to leave the EU. But even Mr Osborne did not suggest civil unrest, which the UK chief executive of Amazon is predicting on the front page of today's Times. He would do well to address the unrest amongst his own workforce arising from Amazon's poor employment practices. And if we leave the EU, we will be able to introduce a tax on internet sales and level the playing field with our retailers who pay rates and taxes and face unfair competition from online retailers. As members of the EU, we cannot do that. Amazon, in 2016, routed its revenues through Mr. Juncker's tax haven, that is Luxembourg, for the whole of the EU, and paid a sum total of £15 million in tax on revenues of £19.5 billion. The Irish Prime Minister has a very short memory. When the EU left Ireland swinging in the wind after the financial crisis, it was the United Kingdom that lent them tens of billions of pounds to lessen the catastrophic consequences of their membership of the euro. The Taoiseach's position on the border is to say the least confusing. The Irish Times of the 19th of July reports him as saying that the European Union had assured him that no physical checks will be needed on the border, even if the UK crashes out without a deal. Ireland's exports to Britain across the Irish Sea are essential to the Irish economy. 70% of their beef alone, for example, comes to the UK. There is already a land border for tax, duty and currency differences between the Republic and Northern Ireland. Customs officials on both sides have said that our leaving the EU does not create a need for a so-called hard border. The actual trade across the land border is a tiny fraction of that with the UK. If both governments say they will not countenance a hard border, who exactly is going to put a hard border there? The EU? I think not. This border issue is a Trojan horse. It is a Trojan horse pushed into the negotiations by people determined to reverse the UK's decision to leave the EU, and we've heard a lot from them this morning. My right honourable friend, Lord Heseltine, asked, what did the people vote for? The reason people voted to leave the EU are not just economic, although I believe in time it offers a bright future for our country once we are unshackled from the sclerotic bureaucracy that is the European Union. It was about being free again to make and unmake our own laws, to hold government to account for the rules and regulations that dominate our daily lives, to decide for ourselves our immigration policy and how our money is spent, to be free of the jurisdiction of a foreign court, to control our own natural resources, and to offer markets to developing countries around the world. As a boy, I was brought up in Arbroath. I watched a great fishing fleet be destroyed, along with the associated industries, by the CFP, and successive governments of this country powerless to help. It is not for this or any other parliament to give away the powers which come from the people and with which it is entrusted without their consent, far less to wilfully ignore the results of a referendum. 2020 is the 700th anniversary of the Declaration of Arbroath. It was a letter in Latin to the Pope, signed by 8 earls and 45 barons, some of whose descendants are actually in this house today. The words come tumbling down the centuries. We fight, not for glory, nor riches, nor honours, but for freedom alone, which no honest man surrenders but with his life. They were delivered to Rome. Today we should dispatch them to Brussels. Yeah.